We are very fortunate to have Katrhrin Wolf with us all the way from Munich. Katrhrin is a senior scientist at the Helmholtz Zentrum Munchen who works with environmental epidemiology. And one of her research interests is within the field of air pollution. Today, she will present the health effects of ultrafine particles, which are of emerging concern and interest in the field of air quality research and monitoring. So thank you very much, Katrhrin, for joining us today. I saw you here. Yeah, you are with us, right? Yeah.
Yes.
That's great. So
I hope you can hear me. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Then so you can share
my slides. Yes, in a second. Let me. So can you see them now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, then many thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to talk about health effects of ultrafine particles. I go I would suggest if something is unclear in between, you feel free to interrupt me and anytime, and we can clarify directly. But otherwise, we can also clarify everything in the discussion after my talk. Yeah. So I'd like to start with a bit of, now it works. I'd like to start with a bit of history. And actually the first evidence of health effects of ultrafine particles was a panel study in asthmatics that was conducted in the 90s by the head of our institute, Annette Peters. And she and her colleagues at that time, they looked at peak expiratory flow, which is an indicator of lung function, which you can see here on the left side on the y-axis. And a decrease of lung function is, of course, an adverse health effect. And this was associated with fine particles, also classical pollutants, but especially ultrafine particles, which are shown here in this area. There's more pronounced effects. So they observed a decreased lung function on days with high ultrafine particles. So then in 2013, the Health Effects Institute for the first time conducted a review to understand the health effects of amide ultrafine particles. And at that time, they concluded that experimental and epidemiological studies indicate adverse health effects from short-term exposure to UFP, but no studies on long-term exposure are available. So for those maybe who are not so familiar with this difference between short-term and long-term exposure, short-term means exposure several hours or several days or 1 to several days, whereas long-term means an exposure of 1 year or even longer. So that's what we basically are exposed at our home addresses or at work, whereas these short-term exposures happen during commuting or in traffic. So then 6 years later, a systematic literature review was conducted from the German and Swiss environmental agencies. And the conclusion was that the evidence increased since 2013. However, the conclusions were did mainly not significantly change from the HEI report in 2013. So most evidence was available at that time for subclinical outcomes, especially for cardiopulmonary outcomes and inflammation. However, there's little evidence for the independence of ultrafine particle effects. So is there real an effect of the ultrafine particles, or is it just the ultrafine particles and as an indicator for other air pollutants like particulate matter or gases like nitrogen dioxides? And also highly exposed situations need to be investigated, so close to roads and also airports. Then in 2021, the WHO updated their global air quality guidelines and also added a good practice statement on ultrafine particles. So that was the first time that this was mentioned also from WHO in their guidelines. So they suggest to quantify amide ultrafine particles in terms of particle number concentration with a lower limit of 10 nanometers and no restriction on the upper limit. They also suggest to expand the common air quality monitoring strategy by integrating the ultrafine particle monitoring into the existing air quality monitoring. And I also suggest to distinguish between low and high particle number concentration, so to guide the decisions on the priorities of UFP source control. So, and as low, they considered concentrations below 1,000 particles per centimeter cube as a 24-hour mean, and high as above 10,000 particles per centimeter cube as a 24-hour mean, or above 20,000 particles per centimeter cube as a 1-hour mean. And fourth, they suggest to utilize emerging science and technologies to advance the assessment of exposure to UFP for the application in epidemiological studies. So only last year, the European Union revised the Ambient Air Quality Directive, and the Council just agreed last October to that. However, there is no standard or recommendation for UFP, but they suggest the measurements of UFP at super sites, like to promote or increase the evidence. And the specific paragraph, like the number 14 says, it is important that pollutants of emerging concern, such as ultrafine particles, black carbon, and so on, should be measured at monitoring super sites at both rural background locations and urban background locations, so to support the scientific understanding. And with that, I now come, so with this history part, I would now come to the health effects. So how can ultrafine particles actually affect our health? And here we need to pay attention to the size, because the size is really important, because this size determines the place of the deposition in our body. So in general, we can breathe in particles that are smaller than 10 micrometer. They reach the upper airways. But the coarse particles, so above 2.5 micrometers, like they stay there, or they get like cleared from the upper airways. But those smaller than 2.5 micrometers, so the fine particulate matter, they can reach the lower airways and our lungs. Those that are smaller than 1 micrometer can even reach the alveoli, and the ultrafine particles on the size range below 100 nanometer, they can cross the lung-blood barrier and translocate into circulation and then reach any organ in our body. And so to go a bit more into detail on the deposition and the mechanisms, so if we breathe in like the particles and like an ultrafine particles that are actually deposited in the nasal cavity may translocate to the brain via the olfactory nerve. The particles that are deposited in the lung might activate the immune system in the lung. So this can lead to local inflammation, but then also to systemic inflammation over the body. Then other particles that are actually cleared from the lung, they might be swallowed, deposited in the upper airways. They can also reach the gastrointestinal tract. And as I already said, the ultrafine particles and the constituents might translocate into the bloodstream. And from there, then also can reach the heart and also reach the brain, and also interact and induce localized and diffuse inflammatory responses in the brain. So we basically observed, so this is now for all, not specifically to ultrafine particles, but for general air pollution and specifically particulate matter. But we observed local and systemic health effects of air pollution basically on the whole body. So we observed associations with the lung, like respiratory disease, morbidity and mortality, lung cancer. There's also effects on our metabolism, on type 2 or 1 diabetes. There's effects on our vasculature, like higher blood pressure, but also deep venous thrombosis. There are effects on the brain, like increased number of strokes, also neurodegenerative diseases. We observed effects on the heart, like cardiovascular disease, morbidity and mortality that is increased, but also increased number of myocardial infarction events and arrhythmia. And also on reproduction outcomes like premature birth, decreased birth weight. And like these now illustrates the stages of life where we are specifically susceptible to air pollution. This starts already at conception, but also during pregnancy and early childhood. but also like people with chronic illnesses and the elderly. So in the next few slides, I'd like to give you some examples of our research, so like from colleagues and myself. And in the first part, we looked at daily concentrations and how they affect mortality. And this is an example from a time series study that was just published in 2023, and that used measured concentration from monitoring sites, 6 stations that were part of the former German ultrafine aerosol network, which is shown here in this map. So these monitoring sites were spread over the whole country. But for this analysis, we could only get like the health data for 2 states, Bavaria and so we used we used 1 site from Augsburg and 3 sites from Leipzig and 2 sites from Dresden. And we linked this measurement data, so daily concentrations, to the number of deaths due to natural mortality. And we looked not only at the days, like at the concentration of the same day, but also at the lags. So this means the delayed, the concentration of the previous day. So leg 0 is the same day, leg 1 is the previous day, leg 2 to 4 are like previous 2 to 4 days, and so on. And what we observed is an increased, like a delayed association, so which is indicated, like highlighted here. So we observed an association or effects on natural mortality 5 to 7 days later for both like the ultrafine particle fraction, so 10 to 100 nanometer, but also the total particle number concentration, so 10 to 800 nanometer, which was like quite similar. But we didn't see any associations for the other air pollutants like black carbon, PM2.5, or NO2. And these findings basically corroborate studies in Erfurt, also Germany, in the 90s. We then also looked at cause-specific respiratory mortality, and we saw clear association here, again, also for ultrafine particles and the total particle number concentration that were even more pronounced for the smaller size fraction. And that were also like already at like observed at leg 2 to 4 and also this 7-day average. And also this confirms findings that we already reported in a previous study, a multi-center study from Germany and Eastern Europe, the UFIPEC project. And in a sub-analysis, then we also looked at the or splitted again the ultrafine particles into 2 different size fractions, the nucleation mode, which is the very small particles from 10 to 30 nanometers, and the Aitken mode, which is like 30 to 100 nanometers. And then we also looked at this accumulation mode, which is the larger particles, 100 to 800 nanometers. And we clearly can see that the effects for this very small size fraction are those that were more pronounced. And last, for like natural mortality, I'd like to show some results from a meta-analysis. Unfortunately, this has not been published yet, but my colleague pooled together the results of previous studies, so which are all shown here, the specific results. And for example, these Lanzinger results are the ones from the UFIPEC project, and Staffordshire et al. Are also like results from a multi-center analysis where also the city-specific results are given. And my colleague pooled together all these previous studies and observed like that the pooled effect estimate, which is basically everything putting together, is small, but it's significant and it's like an increased risk or association for natural mortality. And with that, I would like to come to the next part of studies, where we looked at not like only natural or not at like the hard outcomes like mortality, but also at vulnerable subgroups. And how ultrafine particles affect the health. And in this first example, we looked at data from the myocardial infarction registry in Augsburg, which registers basically every myocardial infarction in the region. And we linked this with hourly exposure to ultrafine particle metrics. So different metrics, not only the total particle number concentration, which I showed you before, but also other like alternative metrics that might be better or not. That's still in the discussion. Yeah, and so this first figure shows you the particle number concentration for the ultrafine ultrafine, so 10 to 100 nanometers, and this is the effect estimate, which shows the percent difference in cases of myocardial infarctions, and like for a 6-hour lag, so which means like there was the exposure, and 6 hours later we looked at the effect, and we see a clear association. And then we adjusted this model also for other like pollutants or size fractions. So we adjusted for like the particle number concentration, like the larger particles. So this PSC is the particle surface concentration. This is an alternative measure, but also other air pollutants like PM2.5, PM10, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and black carbon. And we basically can see that this effect estimate doesn't change a lot. There's a bit of like variation, but it's always in this confidence interval. This is kind of the uncertainty estimate. So we see a robust association if we adjust. So this is an independent, which indicates an independent effect. So we looked also at the larger particles, so 100 to 500 nanometers, also adjusting for other air pollutants. And also here we see a slight decrease, but it's still in this confidence interval, which means it's still robust and there's no considerable or significant change of the effect estimate. We also, and as an alternative measure, we looked also at particle length concentration. On similar picture here, also a clear association that is robust with adjustment of other air pollutants. And the last indicator was the particle surface concentration, and similar here we can see association, which is robust. So in this next study, we looked at like this was a panel study in diabetes patients, and here we looked at personal ultrafine particle exposures. So the participants were asked to carry such a bag, and in the bag there were devices for personal measurements, so a portable CPC count, like for measuring the ultrafine, the particle number concentration as indicator for ultrafine particles, and also an ECG for measuring the cardiac responses. And in addition, the participants were like asked to fill in a diary to show where they spent basically the time. And this is an example for one of these curves for one participant. So the person started at around 8 a.m. in the morning with the measurements and finished at around 1 p.m. So the person was like walking around, and like in pink, these bubbles indicate the times where the person spent in traffic as a pedestrian. And in gray, you can see the time where the person spent inside at home. So then we linked this data and looked at heart rate, so cardiac function, and as like an indicator, the heart rate. So we used the personal measurements, the personal particle number concentration as in a 5-minute resolution. But we also assessed the PM2.5 exposure from an ambient so from a central site particle measurement site. And we looked at these both indicators. So in red, you see the personal particle number concentration, and in black, the PM2.5 measurement from this monitoring site. And we looked at them separately, so in 2 different models, and we also looked at them together. So this is are the estimates on the right side. And what we basically can see is that the estimates didn't change a lot. Not considerably, so which means again we see an independence of effect of both particle number concentrations as indicator for ultrafine particles and PM2.5. We also looked at indicators of heart rate variability. So a decreased heart rate variability means a reduced function of the heart to adjust for like specific situations. And here on this with the measure SDNN, we clearly saw reduced heart rate variability for both the PNC indicator and PM2.5, which is even more pronounced. And again, this are the single models, and this is the model where they were put together. There is like an indication for independence of effects. For the RMSSD measure here, in that case, we didn't observe an association with the particle number concentration, but with PM2.5. And there was also published recently a meta-analysis on ultrafine particles and effects on heart rate variability. And the meta-analysis also investigated these two measures of heart rate variability, so the SDNN and the RMSSD, and looked at like all studies, so pooled together again all previous studies, and this is the overall effect highlighted in this purple color. But they also looked at subtypes of like only like personal measurements from central sites, acute and delayed effects. And not all of the meta-analyzed estimates are significant, but you can see clearly that there's they go all in the same direction, so to a reduction of heart rate variability. Now, what I showed you as the examples I showed you, they all used short-term exposure, so data from measurement sites or personal measurements. However, if we really want to investigate long-term effects and also investigate individual like long-term effects, so we need to model the ultrafine particles. So to bring like the stations like from the points to a map. And that's currently the big challenge, because like the ultrafine particles are highly variable. And we did a first modeling trial in 2017 for the study region of our CORA cohort, which is located here in the south of Germany. And it consists of the city of Augsburg and two adjacent rather rural districts. And this is how the map looked like. Like we had like several, like 20 monitoring sites that are like most of them were in the city center, but some also in the counties, like spread across the county. So and you can see that clear hotspots in the city area, but also a bit outside, because the city has basically spread over their like administrative borders here. And then also here we can clearly see the former airport. Then, so this map basically shows the annual averages of ultrafine particle concentrations. And these annual average was then assigned to the residential location of our participants. So in this case, more than 2,000 participants. And in one of the first studies, we then looked at an indicator of inflammation, the C-reactive protein. And again, like with the short-term studies, we looked at the ultrafine particles, but also at PM2.5 in single pollutant models, but also adjusted the models vice versa. So we put both pollutants together in a model. And also here, we see an indication for independence of effects, and the ultrafine particle estimate even got a bit stronger. So we see an association of independent effects, I already said. And so the next step was then also to investigate not only air pollution, but also other indicators of the environment, like temperature, vegetation index as an indicator for green space, and also noise and the ultrafine particles. And so we did this in a study where we looked at polyneuropathy, which is a kind of indicator for the damage of the peripheral nerves. And we so similar to what I showed you before, like the first estimate is always the single exposure estimate. So here the estimate for temperature, here the estimate for green space, the vegetation index, noise, and particle number concentration as indicator for ultrafine particles. And here we can see an association, so an increased risk for polyneuropathy. And then we adjusted for the other exposures. So we adjusted for NDVI, noise, and PNC, and so on. And also the ultrafine particle estimate was adjusted for temperature, vegetation, and noise. And again, we see robust or independent effects of ultrafine particles, independent of temperature, green space, or noise. We then also stratified our participants into non-obese and obese participants and looked again at the exposures and observed that those in the obese, the effects were even more pronounced. So it seems that adipose participants are more vulnerable to ultrafine particles in our study. And now my last example, where we like from the German National Cohort, which is currently the largest population-based cohort in Germany, and has recruited participants in 18 study centers spread across 16 study regions, which are indicated here in the map. And for the Bavarian part, we refined our land use regression models that I just presented to you for the Augsburg area. So now we took measurements and also conducted new measurements in Augsburg and updated the model and then transferred this model to the Regensburg area to build also a map here, and so to assign this map then to the participants. So again, the map reflects the annual average concentrations, and we assigned it to the residences of our participants. And in that case, it was around 27,000 participants. And for those, we looked at cardiovascular diseases and could observe clear association with hypertension, with myocardial infarction, and also chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. There was an indication for stroke and diabetes, but both were not significant. And similar as in the other studies, we also adjusted for other air pollutants. So we adjusted for PM2.5, black carbon, and NO2. And we observed a robust association for hypertension and also myocardial infarction. We saw a decrease for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but not for PM2.5, but only the traffic-related air pollutants. So also here, we saw an independence of the association of UFP from PM2.5 or NO2. And now it is one of my second last slide, I think, what are the main sources of ultrafine particles. So, and for the sources, we need first to distinguish between primary ultrafine particles, which are actually directly emitted. So the particles that are directly emitted by basically oil combustion sources, and secondary UFP. And these are the new particle formation from gaseous precursors. And there are certain situations where this is there's an increased new particle formation, for example, when there's high solar irradiation and low air pollution, from other pollutants. And the main sources actually in urban areas are combustion from road transport, aviation, and shipping, but also the emissions from industrial sources, from power plants. Residential heating is also becoming more and more important, and biomass burning. And also with electric cars and hybrid cars and so on, and diesel filters, brake abrasion, and road tire interaction has become also a main source. Regarding natural sources, these are forest fires or volcanic eruptions, but also marine aerosols, local minerals, and runoff. And potential measures to reduce ultrafine particles, since we have actually similar sources as with the already regulated pollutants like PM2.5 and NO2, also like measures to reduce these, also like reduce also ultrafine particles, or can reduce ultrafine particles. So if they have the same source, but not, of course, for the new particle formations. So these are independent of these. But measures for like the road traffic, transport, and so on could be, for example, charging and parking policies, so to reduce individual vehicle use in urban areas. Could be also low emission zones, so to ban high polluting vehicles, but also to promote public transport, walking and cycling. And there's also studies that also show side effects, so that this also improves our health through the increased physical activity. And then, of course, there might be UFP-specific measures to reduce emissions, specifically from aviation or from shipping, from industrial sources or residential heating. And so to sum up, and my take-home message for you would be like there's evidence on ultrafine particle health effects, but it's limited, unfortunately, due to the lack of routine measurements, especially studies that assess jointly with like the ultrafine particles with the criteria pollutants. But hopefully this like gets now in future better with like also the measurements at the super sites that are foreseen in the EU. There are studies on short-term exposure which showed independent health effects of ultrafine particles, and the first studies on long-term exposure indicate also an independence of the health effects. The WHO now recommends a kind of threshold, 10,000 particles per centimeter cubed as a 24-hour mean. And yeah, the new directive adds the UFP measurements at the super sites, which I already told you. Yeah, and with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions now.
Thank you very much, Katrhrin, for such an interesting and enlightening presentation. Are there any questions? Yeah, there's one here.
Hi, my name is Eivind Versted. I'm working at the Meteorological Institute in Norway. I just wondered about that map. Maybe you said it, but I didn't catch it. You may have a map of annual mean particle number concentrations, but what kind of data was that map based on?
Let me just quickly share again. So you can see the slides again, right? Fully?
We see the summary slide.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good. So that's the map, or we can also see this map. So this is basic. Now let's go back to the one where you also see the monitoring sites. So we measured particle number concentrations at the monitoring sites 3 times for 2 weeks within 1 year. So we tried to cover the cold, the warm season, and an intermediate season. And then we adjusted. So we had one continuous site that was running like the whole year. So we temporarily adjusted these biweekly measurements to get an annual average. And then we basically built a regression model where we like included or offered spatial predictors to the model to best predict these measured data. And as spatial predictors, we had like the land use data. So if it's industrial area, if it's green area, if it's agricultural area, like we also had the road network, we also had traffic intensities in, also altitude, and some other predictors, which I don't remember, but it's like the refined model also included like satellite data from remote sensing, so the NO2, also like we had indicators for wind, so the prevailing wind directions. We also had like imperviousness data. We had this vegetation data, tree cover density, and so on. So, and we offered this to the model and let the model then, based on some criteria, choose so the best predictors. So this was a kind of supervised learning model. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you. We
Thank
have
you.
one more question here.
Katrhrin Wolf from the Environmental Agency, Oslo Kommune. Katrhrin, last time we talked, you mentioned that the effects are more comparable of ultrafine particles to NO2. I asked you back then, but maybe you can repeat and fill in a bit the gaps.
So it's maybe not necessarily the effects on health, but like the correlation. There's like the correlation between ultrafine particles and nitrogen dioxide or black carbon, which are also traffic related, and particles are traffic related air pollutants are usually higher than the correlation with PM2.5, which is more homogeneously distributed across like the city. So we quite often see higher correlation with NO2 and black carbon, but not PM2.5. So that's why we also see this like independence, I think, of effects with PM2.5. However, like it really depends on the sources that we have in a city. So in our like the map, we have a lot of traffic indicators. So this is quite traffic oriented. We do not have very good indicators, or we did not have very good indicators, and still do not have good indicators for biomass burning or residential heating. So we didn't offer this. So this is not displayed from the map, of course. Then we also do not have, for example, this new particle formation. This is something which is also not so clear, like the differences of, if there are differences of health effects of ultrafine particles that are emitted like directly, or are like the secondary ultrafine particles that are basically formed from gaseous precursors. So, and this is also not displayed in our map. So our map basically shows the traffic related ultrafine particles, which is highly correlated, as I said. Is that, does it answer your question, or do you want to have like more insights into something specifically?
No, thanks. Generally for the answer, I think it's fine. But this brings also to one short remark, because it said it's to be measured in supersites, but there's an additional article in Annex 3 that actually specifies that they also need to be measured at sites where high concentrations are expected to exist. 1 station per 5 million inhabitants. Now Norway is tiny in terms of population, so there will be 1 station. But I mean, for Germany, it's 16 we're talking about. So, but that's a different scale of population. But so we will have to also identify for us the hotspot in Norway. Because that's also, I mean, we had presentations by Finland who found a lot of ultrafine particles close to airports and ports themselves.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
There's also widely different emission pattern.
Yeah. We especially airports came also into focus of research in the last years, ultrafine particle research and health effects from airports. And we can clearly see that the particles emitted from the airport are very small, even smaller. So they are in this 10 to 20 nanometer size range. And first health effect studies are coming, but they're like, it's really limited at the moment what we have.
I mean, just a fun fact, this also goes towards not only airports, but also heliports, which we have spread in the city more due to hospitals and stuff like this. So it's turbine emissions we're talking about. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's turbine emissions indeed. Like, and these are again different, but it's also like the tire abrasion, like from all the vehicles that are like running at the airport. So they, of course, like when they're like at the landing and at the landing phase of the plane, but also like all the vehicles that transport something there, and that transport sometimes also the planes to the like their spot, a landing, like their final spot, how to say.
Thank you. We have one more question here from Oslo, and then we have 2 in the chat.
Hey, thank you very much, Katrhrin, for a very interesting presentation. Michael Ronström from Alnab, the Alnab company in Sweden. just a comment there. We're talking outdoors, but there are also a lot of indoor generators for nanoparticles. I did a personal measurement short study when I was in Gothenburg at the headquarters, and I was walking around in the city and went through the city terminal for trains, where the number concentration went from 7,000 per cubic centimeters up to 150,000 being inside the building. So there's a lot of other engines bringing up the nanoparticles like cooking, etc. And this was a public area. So just a short comment that it's not only outdoors, it's in all public indoor applications as well.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and I have to admit that I neglected the indoor sources because our research really focused on the outdoor air, and specifically as this is what we can, so like what can be regulated, of course, like, so if you, like, as you said, if it's public areas inside, this is also a major concern, I think. But of course, like in private homes, if people, what they cook and how they cook, this cannot kind of be regulated, or if they burn a candle or so. But it should be definitely investigated. Yeah.
Yes, now we have 2 questions from the chat, and then I think we have to call it. Yeah.
Yes, the first question, is there much data for exposure of car passengers, drivers to ultrafine particular pollution? And is there likely to be a large difference in the exposure for people sitting in cars in heavy traffic compared to pedestrians?
So I would not say that there's much data. So we did some studies like where we looked at being in traffic. And I think we observed like not only for pedestrians, but also for like people sitting in cars, associations with myocardial infarction. Also, this was done with the myocardial infarction registry, but I'm not sure about the magnitude of the difference. So I would need to look this up, but I can definitely share this article. But otherwise, I'm not aware that there's much like done in like drivers, like sitting in cars versus being outside.
Thank you. And the second question, did you see big variations in ultrafine particle concentration depending on the seasons, summer, winter, colder, warm days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a seasonal variation, and and it's also daily variation. So it's like definitely you can see we can see this commuting pattern. So if you start with the daily variation, we see this commuting pattern. So you have peaks in the morning and the evening when people tend to drive more. But in some of the areas, like not in our area so much, but like in the southern cities, there's also sometimes the peak at like over noon or around noon, where the solar radiation is higher due to this new particle formation processes. So it's quite dependent on the location. So this was reported for the southern cities, whereas this commuting pattern or road, like direct emissions from road transport, was reported for the northern cities. For seasonal variation, we see higher particle number concentration also in winter than in summer. And also, like the commuting days or working days like are higher than weekends.
Thank you, Katrhrin, and thank you for all the good questions.